In Normandy Falls, a 95-year-old veteran was about to face his greatest battle outside a local diner. What started as a peaceful morning walk took a shocking turn when he encountered a group of cruel young adults with cameras. Harold "Hank" Morrison wasn't your typical elderly resident. For 7 decades, he had carried D-Day memories, known for unwavering dignity that survived Nazi beaches. When Tyler Jenkins shoved him to the pavement while filming, Hank had no idea he was igniting a military firestorm. His quiet refusal to press charges would lead to 24 Marines marching into town. What began as viral cruelty would become a reckoning about honor and respect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog clung to Normandy Falls like a familiar blanket, rolling in from the Pacific to soften the edges of the small coastal town. Harold Morrison adjusted his worn Navy watch, 6:30 hours exactly, and stepped onto the sidewalk outside his modest 2-bedroom house. At 95, Hank still kept military time, still pressed his clothes the night before, still made his bed with hospital corners that could bounce a quarter. The walk to Grace's diner took him exactly 12 minutes. He'd been making this journey for 8 years now, ever since Margaret passed, and the house became too quiet, too full of memories that echoed in empty rooms. His cane tapped a steady rhythm against the cracked pavement, passing the same weathered houses with their peeling paint and neglected gardens that spoke of a town slowly surrendering to time. Mrs. Patterson waved from her porch, coffee mug in. "You hand." "Morning, Hank." "Morning, Dolores." His voice carried the slight rasp of age, but remained strong, carrying decades of authority earned on foreign beaches and construction sites. She'd been waving for 8 years, and he'd been waving back, small rituals that kept the world spinning forward. The diner sat on Main Street like a beacon of warmth, its neon sign flickering between Graces and Graces in a dancer's ode. As Hank's morning routine, through the windows he could see the familiar shapes of the breakfast crowd, fishermen heading out for the day, retirees lingering over coffee and newspapers, the comfortable rhythm of a community that still believed. In gathering, Grace Murphy looked up as the bell chimed his arrival, her weathered face creasing into a genuine smile. At 67, she'd been serving this town for 3 decades, and she knew every customer's order, every story, every heartbreak. "The usual, Hank?" She already had the coffee pot in hand. "Yes, ma'am. Black coffee, wheat toast, light on the butter." He settled into his corner booth, the one that gave him a clear view of both entrances. Old habits from places where watching your back meant staying alive. Grace poured his coffee with practiced precision, the steam rising like incense. "Eleanor called yet this week?" Hank's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His daughter's weekly. Calls had become bi-weekly, then monthly, then whenever guilt or business travel schedules aligned. "She's busy with work." Grace's tone carried the weight of 30 years of watching families drift apart. She'd never had children of her own, but she'd mothered half the town through breakfast platters and patient ears. "That girl doesn't know what she's missing." The toast arrived perfectly golden, and Hank ate with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned to appreciate simple pleasures. Around him, the diner hummed with conversation, weather talk, fishing reports, gentle gossip that bound the community together like mortar between bricks. Outside, a group of young adults clustered near the entrance, their voices carrying through the glass. Tyler Jenkins stood at the center, phone in hand, his face lit by the screen's glow as he gestured animatedly to his audience of followers. At 22, Tyler carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences, never known want, never understood that respect was earned rather than inherited. "This whole town is like completely dead," Tyler's voice pierced the morning air as he panned his phone camera across the modest storefronts. Like, seriously, who even lives here? Just a bunch of old people waiting to die. His companions laughed, the hollow sound of youth desperate to prove their sophistication. Marcus Williams shifted uncomfortably, his construction-calloused hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. Something about the mockery didn't sit right, but Tyler was. His way into acceptance, into belonging somewhere after years of being on the outside. Hank finished his toast and left exact change, plus a generous tip on the table. Grace caught his eye and nodded, their morning ritual complete. He stood slowly, his joints protesting the October chill, and made his way toward the door. The collision was immediate and violent. Tyler, still live-streaming and gesturing wildly, bumped into Hank with enough force to send the elderly man stumbling. But instead of apologizing, instead of helping, Tyler's eyes lit up with opportunity. "Oh my God, guys, check this out!" He turned the camera toward Hank, who was struggling to regain his balance. "We've got ourselves a genuine fossil!" Laughter was cruel, cutting through the morning air like broken glass. Hank's face burned with humiliation, but he straightened his shoulders, drawing on decades of dignity earned through service and sacrifice. "Excuse me, son," his voice carried. Quiet authority, the tone of someone accustomed to respect. "Son?" Tyler mimicked, his voice dripping with fake reverence. "Did you hear that, chat? Grandpa thinks he's still in charge." His followers in the chat exploded with laughing emojis and cruel comments that fed Tyler's growing confidence. Marcus felt his stomach twist. This wasn't right. This wasn't what he'd signed up for when he'd started hanging around Tyler's crowd. But the words wouldn't come, trapped behind years of wanting to belong somewhere, anywhere. "How about you move? A little faster, old-timer." Tyler stepped closer, his phone camera capturing every moment. "Some of us have places to be." Hank's hand tightened on his cane. 75 years ago, he'd been 19 years old, crammed into a landing craft approaching Omaha Beach, while machine gun fire carved through his friends like wheat before a scythe. He'd learned then that some battles chose you. I said, "Excuse me." Each word carried the weight of a man who'd never backed down from a fight, even when the odds were impossible. Tyler's expression shifted, his entertainment turning to irritation. The old man wasn't playing along, wasn't cowering like Tyler expected. In front of his audience, with his friends watching, with his reputation on the line, Tyler made a choice that would echo through the entire town. He shoved Hank hard. The impact sent the elderly veteran stumbling backward, his cane flying as he fought to stay upright. But 95-year-old bones are brittle, and balance is a luxury of youth. Hank crashed to the pavement with a sickening thud, his head striking the concrete with a sound that would haunt Marcus Williams for the rest of his life. Tyler's phone captured it all, the fall, the blood pooling beneath Hank's silver hair, the way the old man's body seemed to crumple like paper. The chat exploded with reactions, a digital mob feeding on cruelty. "Holy shit, did you see that?" Tyler laughed, the sound high and nervous. "Old dude went down like a sack of potatoes." Inside the diner, Grace Murphy witnessed the assault through the window and was already moving, her protective instincts overriding everything else. Other witnesses stood frozen in shock. Mrs. Patterson with her coffee mug halfway to her lips, postal worker Jim Crawford stopping mid-step on his route, several fishermen turning from their trucks. Hank lay on the cold concrete, tasting blood, and feeling the familiar burn of gravel embedded in his cheek. For a moment, he was 19 again, pinned down by enemy fire on a beach in France, watching his best friend Tommy Kowalski die 3 feet away. The same helplessness, the same taste of copper and defeat. But this wasn't France. This was home. This was the community he'd helped build with his own hands, nail by nail, year by year. And these weren't Nazi soldiers. They were children who'd forgotten that respect was the foundation of civilization. Tyler and his friends were already walking away, their laughter fading as they moved toward their cars, completely unaware that their actions had been witnessed by a dozen people who knew Hank's story, who'd shared coffee with him for years, who understood exactly what they'd just seen. Grace reached Hank first, her knees cracking as she knelt beside him on the pavement. "Easy, honey. Don't move too fast." "I'm fine." The words came automatically, a lifetime of refusing to show weakness, but blood was trickling from his temple, and his hands were scraped raw from breaking his fall. "Like hell you are." Grace's voice carried the authority of someone who'd been caring for this community since before Tyler Jenkins was born. "Jim! Call Sheriff Chen!" Hank struggled to sit up, his pride warring with his body's protests. Around him, the witnesses began to gather, not crowding but forming a protective circle that spoke of genuine care. "Just need to catch my breath," Hank insisted, though his voice shook slightly. Inside his chest, his heart hammered with the adrenaline of combat, his body remembering battles fought before these children were even born. Grace helped him to his feet, her strong arms supporting his weight. "Come on inside, let's get you cleaned up." As they made their way toward the diner's warmth, neither of them noticed postal worker Jim Crawford, already on his radio, or Mrs. Patterson hurrying toward her house to call her nephew at the Marine base. They didn't see the way Marcus Williams had stopped walking, his face pale with guilt and recognition of what he'd just been part of. The fog was beginning to lift from Normandy Falls, and with it came the first stirrings of something that would change everything. In a community that still believed in right and wrong, in protecting those who'd already given their everything, word was about to spread with the speed that only small towns could achieve. Hank Morrison might have fallen, but he wasn't alone. And sometimes that made all the difference between a moment of cruelty and a reckoning that would define a community's soul. The blood had barely dried on Grace's paper towels when Sheriff Patricia Chen's patrol car pulled up outside the diner. Grace had cleaned Hank's wounds with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd bandaged everything from kitchen burns to fishing accidents, but the cut on his temple still seeped crimson through the makeshift bandage. "I told you, Grace, I don't need all this fuss." Hank sat stiffly in the corner booth, his dignity bruised worse than his body. Around him the breakfast crowd had returned to their coffee and conversations, but their voices carried an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there an hour before. Sheriff Chen entered with the measured stride of someone who'd learned to read a room's temperature instantly. At 45, she carried herself with the quiet authority that came from 15 years of military police service, followed by a decade protecting this coastal community. Her eyes swept the diner, cataloging witnesses, assessing the situation with tactical precision. "Morning, Grace, Mr. Morrison." She slid into the booth, across from Hank, her uniform crisp despite the early hour. "I understand we had an incident this morning." It was nothing. Hank's jaw set with the stubborn pride of someone who'd spent 75 years refusing to be seen as a victim. "Young man was in a hurry, that's all." Grace snorted from behind the counter. "Nothing, my ass. That Jenkins boy shoved him down like he was clearing a path. Had his phone out, filming the whole damn thing like it was some kind of joke." Sheriff Chen pulled out her notebook, her pen poised. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to tell me exactly what happened, in your own words." For the next 20 minutes, Hank reluctantly recounted the morning's events, his voice steady, but his hands trembling slightly as he described Tyler's deliberate cruelty. Grace corroborated every detail, her anger simmering just beneath her professional restraint. Other witnesses, Mrs. Patterson, Jim Crawford, 2 fishermen who'd been loading their truck, confirmed the deliberate nature of the assault. "Mr. Morrison," Sheriff Chen said gently, "this wasn't an accident. Tyler Jenkins deliberately pushed you to the ground while filming it. That's assault on an elderly person. I can arrest him this afternoon." Hank shook his head slowly. "I don't want to press charges." "Hank," Grace started. "No," His voice carried the finality of someone accustomed to making hard decisions. "That boy made a mistake. Young people do foolish things. I won't have his whole life ruined over one moment of poor judgment." Sheriff Chen studied the old veteran's face, recognizing the moral complexity that separated good law enforcement from mere rule enforcement. "Mr. Morrison, with respect, this wasn't just poor judgment. And Tyler Jenkins has a history. Outside the diner, 15 miles east at Marine Corps Training Base Normandy, Private First Class Danny Chen was finishing his morning phone call with his aunt when she mentioned the incident at Grace's diner. Danny's face darkened as she described the assault on the old veteran, his young features hardening with an anger that surprised him. "Aunt Pat, are you sure? Someone actually pushed Mr. Morrison down and filmed it. Saw it with my own eyes, Danny. That Jenkins boy and his little pack of friends laughing like it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. Poor Hank's head was bleeding all over Grace's sidewalk." Danny ended the call and sat in the common area for a long moment, staring at his phone. Around him, other Marines went about their morning routines, some heading to chow, others preparing for training exercises. But Danny's mind was fixed on an image, a 95-year-old man lying on concrete while children laughed at his pain. He found Staff Sergeant Maria Santos in the training facility, supervising weapons maintenance with the focused intensity that made her one of the most respected drill instructors on base. At 28, Santos carried herself with the coiled energy of someone who'd earned every stripe through merit and determination. "Staff Sergeant?" Danny approached carefully, knowing better than to interrupt Santos lightly. "What is it, Chen?" "Ma'am, my aunt just called. There was an incident in town this morning. A group of locals assaulted an elderly veteran, 95 years old, served in World War II. Santos's hands stilled on the rifle she was inspecting. Her grandfather had been a World War II veteran, Pacific Theater, Purple Heart recipient, who died alone in a VA facility while bureaucrats shuffled paperwork. The familiar rage began building in her chest, the same fire that had driven her to enlist, to prove herself, to protect those who'd already given everything. "Details, Chen." Danny recounted his aunt's description, watching Santos's expression grow darker with each word. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her knuckles white where they gripped the rifle. "How many witnessed this assault?" "At least 6 people, ma'am, maybe more." Santos set down the rifle with deliberate precision. Around them, other Marines had begun to listen, drawn by the tension in their staff sergeant's voice. Word traveled, fast in military units, especially when it involved one of their own, and every veteran was family, regardless of branch or era. "Gather the squad, Chen. Conference room, 10 minutes. Within an hour, the story had spread through the base like wildfire. Marines clustered in small groups, their conversations growing heated as details emerged. These were young men and women who'd volunteered to serve, who understood sacrifice and honor not as abstract concepts, but as daily realities. The idea of someone attacking a veteran, their elder, their inspiration, their reason for serving, struck at the very core of everything they believed. Captain James Rodriguez found Santos briefing 24 Marines in the main conference room, her voice carrying the controlled fury of someone struggling to maintain military discipline. "Staff Sergeant, what's the situation here?" Santos snapped to attention. "Sir, we have a civilian assault on a 95-year-old D-Day veteran in Normandy Falls. Multiple witnesses confirm the attack was deliberate and filmed for social media entertainment." Rodriguez felt his own anger spike, but kept his expression neutral. At 35, he'd learned to balance the protective instincts of his Marines with the diplomatic requirements of base command. But the thought of someone attacking a D-Day veteran tested even his legendary self-control. "Has civilian law enforcement been notified?" "Yes, sir. But according to reports, the victim is refusing to press charges. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the assembled Marines. The concept of allowing such disrespect to go unpunished was alien to their understanding of justice and honor. "Sir," Santos continued, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "request permission to organize a community outreach visit, show of support for our local veteran population." Rodriguez recognized the carefully neutral language that barely concealed what his Marines really wanted to do. He also understood that young Marines driven by righteous anger could create diplomatic incidents that would echo far beyond this small coastal town. "Stand down, Staff Sergeant. No unauthorized contact with civilians regarding this incident." Sir, that's an order, Santos." But Rodriguez also understood that orders only went so far when Marines felt their honor and their brothers were under attack. As he dismissed the briefing, he could see the determination in their faces, the quiet conversations that would continue long after he left the room. Back at Grace's diner, Sheriff Chen was finishing her report when her radio crackled with a call from the base. Captain Rodriguez's voice was carefully professional as he requested a meeting to discuss civilian-military relations regarding recent incidents. Grace refilled Hank's coffee cup as the sheriff stepped outside to take the call. Around them, the breakfast crowd had thinned, but the conversations continued, quiet discussions about respect, about young people, about what kind of community Normandy Falls wanted to be. "You know they won't let this slide," Grace said quietly, settling across from Hank with her own cup. Hank nodded slowly, recognizing the look in the sheriff's eyes when she'd taken his statement. He'd seen that same expression on military faces throughout his life, the moment when individuals became part of something larger, when personal affronts became matters of principle. "I just want to go home," he said quietly. "But Grace is next." Words carried a weight that made his chest tighten. "I don't think that's going to be possible, Hank. Not anymore." Outside, Sheriff Chen ended her call with Captain Rodriguez and stared toward the Marine base, knowing that the morning's incident had already moved far beyond her jurisdiction. In 15 minutes, she would drive to the base for an emergency meeting about containing a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. The ripples were spreading outward from Grace's diner, gathering force and momentum, carrying the morning's cruelty toward a reckoning that would test every principle the community claimed to hold dear. Sheriff Chen's patrol car had barely disappeared down the road toward the Marine base when Staff Sergeant Santos made her decision. Captain Rodriguez's orders had been clear: no unauthorized contact with civilians. But Santos had also sworn an oath to protect and defend, and that oath didn't come with fine print about jurisdiction or diplomatic protocol. Chen, Williams, Rodriguez, gear up, full-dress blues. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd learned to command respect through competence rather than volume. "We're going to town." Private Williams looked uncertain. "Staff Sergeant," the captain said. The captain said no unauthorized contact regarding the incident. "This is a routine community relations patrol." Santos's eyes held a glint that made it clear this was not a discussion. "We're Marines. We protect our own. And that 95-year-old man bleeding on a sidewalk, he's ours." Within 15 minutes, 24 Marines in full-dress uniform formed ranks outside the barracks. The morning sun caught the polished brass of their buttons, the crisp creases of their trousers, the mirror shine of their shoes. This wasn't a mob. This was military precision given purpose. Santos inspected the formation with the practiced eye of someone who understood that appearance was half the battle. These young men and women represented something larger than themselves, something that Tyler Jenkins and his friends had never encountered in their privileged lives. "Listen up," Santos's voice carried across the formation. "We are going to Normandy. Falls to show our respect for a veteran who bled for this country. We will maintain military bearing at all times. We will follow all civilian laws. We will not initiate contact or confrontation, but we will make our presence known. The march into town took 18 minutes, their boots striking the pavement in perfect synchronization. Townspeople stopped their morning routines to watch the unusual sight. Marines in dress blues moving through their streets with the focused determination of a military operation. Tyler Jenkins sat outside Coastal Coffee with his usual crew, still riding the high from his viral video. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, likes, shares, comments from strangers who found his humiliation of the old man hilarious. He'd gained 300 followers since morning, his biggest social media boost ever. "Dude, this is insane," laughed Kevin Morrison, no relation to Hank, despite the shared name. "You're like internet famous now?" Tyler basked in the attention, scrolling through comments that ranged from cruel laughter to outraged condemnation. He ignored the negative responses, focusing on the validation from strangers who shared his contempt for anyone they deemed weak or irrelevant. Marcus Williams sat apart from the group, his conscience gnawing at him like hunger. Every time Tyler replayed the video, Marcus saw Hank's face, not just the pain of hitting the pavement, but the deeper hurt of being treated as less than human. It reminded him of his own grandmother, who died alone in a nursing home while Marcus was too busy chasing acceptance to visit. "Maybe we should delete it," Marcus said quietly. Tyler looked at him like he'd suggested setting money on fire. "Are you crazy? This thing's going viral. I'm up to 50,000 views already." That's when they heard the sound, the rhythmic striking of boots on pavement, growing closer with each step. The conversation died as 24 Marines in full-dress blues rounded the corner and marched into the town square with military precision. Tyler's phone slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers as the Marines formed a perfect circle around the coffee shop's outdoor seating area. They moved with the fluid coordination of a drill team, each Marine taking position at precise intervals, creating an unmistakable perimeter. Staff Sergeant Santos called the formation to attention, and 24 pairs of polished shoes snapped, together with a sound like thunder. Then, in perfect unison, they assumed parade rest, feet shoulder-width apart, hands clasped behind their backs, eyes forward. They said nothing. They did nothing threatening. They simply stood there, a living wall of military discipline and silent judgment surrounding Tyler and his friends like a human fortress. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Tyler felt his mouth go dry as he looked around at the Marines. Young faces set in expressions of controlled anger, older NCOs, whose eyes held the weight of combat experience, all of them united in their silent condemnation of his actions. "What? What do they want?" Kevin whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning fog. Marcus knew exactly what they wanted. These Marines had seen Tyler's video, had watched him push a 95-year-old veteran to the ground while laughing about it. They'd come to deliver a message that needed no words. You picked the wrong target. Townspeople began gathering at the edges of the square, drawn by the unprecedented sight of uniformed Marines surrounding a group of local young adults. Mrs. Patterson stood next to postal worker Jim Crawford, both of them wearing expressions of grim satisfaction. Grace Murphy arrived from the diner, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes bright with approval. Tyler tried to stand, but his legs felt weak. The Marines didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence was overwhelming. He'd never been held accountable for anything in his life. His father's money and influence had always created a protective bubble around him. But money and influence meant nothing to these men and women who'd volunteered to serve something greater than themselves. Sheriff Chen's patrol car pulled up to the square, and she stepped out with the careful movements of someone walking into a potential powder keg. Her radio crackled as she called for backup, but her voice remained calm, professional. Captain Rodriguez arrived 3 minutes later, his face a mask of controlled fury. He surveyed the scene. His Marines in perfect formation, the crowd of townspeople, Tyler Jenkins cowering in the center of it all, like a child caught stealing. "Staff Sergeant Santos." Rodriguez's voice carried across the square with parade ground. "Authority." "Sir." Santos snapped to attention but didn't move from her position. "Explain this formation." "Community Relations Patrol, sir, showing support for our local veteran population." Rodriguez recognized the careful phrasing that skirted the edge of his orders without technically violating them. His Marines had found a way to obey the letter of military law while delivering a message that Tyler Jenkins would never forget. The standoff continued for another 10 minutes. Marines at attention, townspeople watching, Tyler and his friends trapped in the center of a silent judgment that was more powerful than any words. Finally, Rodriguez made his decision. "Formation! Attention!" 24 Marines snapped to attention with mechanical precision. "Right face! Forward march!" The Marines marched away with the same discipline they'd shown in arriving, leaving Tyler and his friends alone in the square, but forever changed. The message had been delivered without a single word being spoken, without a single law being broken, without a single threat being made. As the sound of marching boots faded into the distance, Tyler looked around at the faces of the townspeople still gathered in the square. Where once he'd seen a community that would tolerate his behavior, he now saw witnesses to his humiliation, people who would remember this moment every time they looked at him. Marcus stood up slowly, his decision crystallizing with painful clarity. "I can't do this anymore, Tyler. What are you talking about?" "This, us, what we did to that old man." Marcus's voice grew stronger with each word. "Those Marines just showed us what real strength looks like, and it sure as hell isn't pushing down 95-year-old veterans for internet points. As..." Marcus walked away. Tyler was left alone with the remainder of his crew, and the growing realization that his viral moment had just become the biggest mistake of his privileged life. The Marines were gone, but their message lingered in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Some lines should never be crossed, some people should never be touched, and some actions carry consequences that no amount of money or influence can erase. 3,000 miles away in Seattle, Eleanor Morrison's phone buzzed insistently during the quarterly board meeting at Pinnacle Technology Solutions. She glanced at the screen, Normandy Falls area code, and felt the familiar knot of guilt tighten in her stomach. Another call from home meant another problem she'd have to manage from a distance, another reminder of responsibilities she'd been avoiding. "Eleanor, your thoughts on the Q4 projections?" The CEO's voice cut through her distraction. She forced herself to focus on the presentation, on the numbers that had consumed her life for the past 15 years. At 62, Eleanor had built her career on being indispensable, on being the executive who never let personal matters interfere with business objectives. But the phone kept buzzing. When the meeting finally broke for lunch, she found 7 missed calls and a voicemail from Grace Murphy that made her blood run cold. "Eleanor, honey, you need to come home. Your father's been hurt. Some kids attacked him outside the diner this morning. He's okay. Well, he says he's okay. But there's Marines involved now and the whole town's talking. He needs you." Eleanor stared at her phone screen. Grace's words, echoing in the sterile conference room. Attacked. Marines involved. Her father, 95 years old, stubborn as granite, too proud to ask for help, had been hurt while she sat in meetings discussing profit margins. She was booking a flight before her conscious mind caught up with her actions. Back in Normandy Falls, Robert Jenkins paced the polished floors of his waterfront office, his phone pressed to his ear as he tried to understand why his son was suddenly the center of a military incident. As the owner of 3 successful construction companies and half the commercial real estate in town, Robert was accustomed to solving problems with money, influence, and carefully placed donations. "What do you mean Marines surrounded him?" Robert's voice carried the frustration of someone whose usual solutions weren't working. "Tyler's just a kid. Kids do stupid things." His assistant, Margaret Torres, had been fielding calls all morning. From Sheriff Chen, from concerned business partners, from Tyler himself, who'd called crying about being terrorized by the military. But Margaret had also heard the other side of the story from her sister, who worked at Grace's diner and had witnessed the assault. "Mr. Jenkins," Margaret said carefully, "maybe you should talk to Tyler about what actually happened this morning." Robert dismissed her concern with a wave. He'd been dismissing concerns about Tyler for 22 years, writing checks to make problems disappear, using his influence to smooth over his son's mistakes. In his mind, this was just another mess that money could clean up. He was wrong. Eleanor's plane touched down at the small regional airport at 4:30 p.m., Pacific fog, rolling in from the ocean like a grey blanket. She'd made this flight exactly 4 times in the past 8 years, twice for her mother's funeral arrangements, once for her father's brief hospitalization after a fall, and once for Christmas 3 years ago that had ended in an argument about her never visiting. The rental car felt foreign after years of Seattle traffic and corporate car services. As she drove through Normandy Falls toward her childhood home, she noticed the clusters of people standing outside businesses, their conversations stopping as she passed. Something had happened here, something bigger than a simple assault. She found Hank at Normandy Community Hospital, not because he'd agreed to treatment, but because Sheriff Chen had finally convinced him to get his head wound properly examined. Eleanor walked into the small emergency room and saw her father sitting on an examination table, his silver hair stark against the white bandage covering his temple. He looked smaller than she remembered, frailer, the robust man who'd carried her on his shoulders, who'd built their house with his own hands, who'd seemed invincible throughout her childhood, now appeared breakable in the harsh fluorescent light. "Dad?" Her voice cracked despite her attempts to maintain composure. Hank looked up, and for a moment his face showed surprise, then pleasure, then the careful guarding that had characterized their relationship for the past decade. "Eleanor, you didn't need to come all this way." "Yes, I did." She moved closer, seeing the bruises on his hands, the scrapes on his face that spoke of concrete and cruelty. Grace called. She said someone attacked you. Hank's jaw tightened. "It was nothing. Young man was in a hurry, accidentally bumped into me." "Dad, stop." Eleanor had inherited his stubbornness along with his grey eyes, and 15 years of corporate negotiations had taught her to recognize deflection. Grace said they filmed it, said they pushed you down on purpose. For the first time since she'd arrived, Hank met her eyes directly. In them, she saw not just the physical pain of his injuries, but something deeper, the humiliation of being treated as disposable, the hurt of being mocked for his age and vulnerability. "Why didn't you call me immediately?" she asked. "What could you have done from Seattle? You have your important job, your important life. This is just small-town drama." The words hit her like a physical blow, carrying 8 years of accumulated guilt and missed phone calls and excuses about work. Commitments. My important life. "Dad, you're my family. You're all the family I have left." "Could have fooled me," Hank said quietly, but without malice. "Last time we talked was... when was it? 6 weeks ago? 7? Eleanor felt tears threatening and forced them back through sheer will. "I know I haven't been. I know I should have visited more, called more, but I'm here now." Dr. Sarah Kim entered with Hank's discharge papers, her expression professional but concerned. "Mr. Morrison, you have a mild concussion and some deep bruising, but no fractures. You need to take it easy for the next few days. No driving, no heavy lifting. Is there someone who can stay with you?" Hank started to protest, but Eleanor cut him off. "Yes, I'll be staying with him." After they left the hospital, Eleanor drove her father through the town where she'd grown up, seeing it now through adult eyes that recognized the economic struggles, the aging population, the sense of a community slowly being left behind. But she also saw the people standing outside Grace's diner, the way they nodded respectfully as Hank passed, the genuine concern in their faces. "Tell me what really happened this morning," she said as they pulled into his driveway. Hank was quiet for a long moment, studying the house where he'd lived for 50 years, where he'd raised a daughter who'd grown too busy to visit. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone confronting uncomfortable truths. A young man named Tyler Jenkins thought it would be entertaining to push an old man down and film it for the internet. His friends laughed. The whole thing went viral, apparently. Hank's hands trembled slightly as he unbuckled his seatbelt. But you know what hurt more than hitting the pavement? The look in his eyes when he looked at me, like I was nothing, like I was already dead and just too stubborn to lie down. Eleanor felt something break open in her chest. Grief, rage, and a fierce protective instinct she hadn't felt since she was young enough to believe her father was invincible. "What happened after that?" Grace mentioned Marines. Hank smiled. For the first time since she'd arrived, an expression that mixed pride with concern. 24 Marines in dress blues marched into town and surrounded that boy and his friends. Didn't say a word, didn't make a single threat. Just stood there in formation until he understood that some actions have consequences. As they walked toward the house, Eleanor noticed the neighbors watching from their windows, the way they nodded toward her father with genuine respect. This was his community, his home, his life, and she'd been absent from all of it. "Dad, I want to understand. What's happening here? All of it, and I want to help." Hank paused at his front door, studying his daughter's face. "This isn't your fight, Eleanor. You have your own life to get back to." "Maybe it's time I reconsidered what my life actually is," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time I came home." For the first time in years, Hank Morrison allowed himself to hope that his daughter had finally grown wise enough to understand what truly mattered. But first, they both had to navigate the storm that Tyler Jenkins had unleashed. A storm that was far from over. The Normandy Falls High School Gymnasium hadn't seen this much activity since the state basketball championships 15 years ago. By 7 p.m., every folding chair was occupied, and people lined the walls 3 deep. The emergency town meeting had been called by Mayor Patricia Hendricks, a nervous woman who'd spent her 2 terms in office managing parking disputes and zoning issues, not military standoffs and viral assault videos. Eleanor sat in the front, row beside her father, her protective instincts on high alert as she studied the crowd. The divisions were immediately apparent. Marines and their families clustered on the left side of the gym, Tyler's supporters and concerned business owners on the right, with longtime residents scattered throughout looking uncomfortable and uncertain. Captain Rodriguez entered in full dress uniform, followed by Staff Sergeant Santos and a contingent of Marine personnel. Their presence transformed the gymnasium's atmosphere from community meeting to something approaching a military tribunal. Conversations died as they took their seats, their bearing radiating the controlled discipline that had made Tyler Jenkins wet himself that afternoon. Sheriff Chen positioned herself near the center aisle, her hand resting casually on her radio. She'd called in backup from the county, knowing that emotions were running too high for small-town politeness to contain. Mayor Hendricks tapped the microphone nervously, the feedback squealing through the old sound system. "Thank you all for coming. We're here to discuss the incident this morning involving Mr. Harold Morrison and subsequent events involving our local Marine training base." "Subsequent events?" Grace Murphy's voice cut through the political euphemism like a knife. You mean when 24 Marines in dress blues marched into town to show a spoiled brat what accountability looks like? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the left side of the gym, while uncomfortable shifting began on the right. Robert Jenkins stood up, his expensive suit and practiced authority marking him as someone accustomed to controlling conversations. Now wait just a minute. Robert's voice carried the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. My son may have made a mistake this morning, but surrounding him with military personnel, that's intimidation, pure and simple. This is America, not some military dictatorship. Staff Sergeant Santos's jaw tightened, but she remained seated, her hands clenched in her lap. Captain Rodriguez placed a restraining hand on her shoulder, recognizing the signs of someone about to violate several regulations regarding civilian interactions. Eleanor found herself standing before she'd consciously decided to speak. Mr. Jenkins, your son didn't make a mistake. He deliberately assaulted a 95-year-old man and filmed it for entertainment. That's not a mistake. That's cruelty. Who are you to judge? Robert shot back. You abandoned your father years ago, left him to fend for himself while you played corporate executive. At least Tyler was here, part of this community. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, carrying enough truth to make her flinch. But then she looked at her father, bruised, bandaged, but sitting straight with the dignity that Tyler Jenkins would never understand, and found her voice. You're right. I did abandon him. I chose my career over my family, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, and I won't let anyone treat him like he's disposable. Hank reached up and squeezed his daughter's hand. Their first moment of connection in years, forged in the heat of public confrontation. Mayor Hendricks tried to regain control. Perhaps we could hear from Captain Rodriguez about the military's perspective. The military's perspective is simple. Rodriguez stood, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd led men in combat. We protect those who've already served. We honor those who sacrificed for our freedom. When someone attacks a D-Day veteran for internet entertainment, that's not just assault, it's desecration of everything we swore to defend. Tyler Jenkins had been sitting in the back row, trying to remain invisible, but his father's public defense forced him into the spotlight. Whispers followed him as he made his way toward the front, his face pale and his hands shaking. I didn't mean for this to get so big. Tyler's voice cracked as he faced the crowd. It was just supposed to be funny. Just a stupid video. Funny? Danny Chen stood up among the Marines, his young face bright with anger. You think assaulting a man who stormed Nazi beaches is funny? The gymnasium erupted in competing voices, some defending Tyler as a misguided kid, others demanding justice, many simply trying to understand how their quiet town had become the center of a moral firestorm. Marcus Williams, who'd been sitting alone near the back, suddenly stood up. I was there. His voice carried across the chaos, causing an immediate hush. I was with Tyler when it happened, and I need to say something. All eyes turned to the young construction worker as he made his way to the front of the gym. His work clothes marked him as different from Tyler's usual crowd, his calloused hands trembling as he faced the community. Tyler didn't just bump into Mr. Morrison, he targeted him, made jokes about old fossils and clearing the way. When Mr. Morrison asked him politely to excuse himself, Tyler got angry, pushed him hard enough to send him flying. Marcus's voice grew stronger with each word, and when Mr. Morrison was lying there bleeding, Tyler laughed, called him a sack of potatoes for his video. The silence that followed was deafening. Tyler's face went white as his former friend stripped away every excuse, every rationalization he'd constructed. Why are you doing this? Tyler whispered. Marcus looked at him with something approaching pity. Because I watched those Marines today, saw what real strength looks like, real honor, and I realized I've been following someone who has neither." Robert Jenkins shot to his feet. "This is character assassination. My son is being railroaded by a military organization that has no business interfering in civilian matters." "Your son," Grace Murphy's voice cut through Robert's bluster, "assaulted a man who earned the right to walk these streets in peace. Those Marines didn't interfere. They reminded him that actions have consequences." Dr. Sarah Kim, who treated Hank's injuries, stood to address the medical facts. Mr. Morrison sustained a concussion, deep bruising, and multiple lacerations from his fall. At his age, this assault could have been fatal. "We're not talking about a harmless prank. We're talking about violence against one of our most vulnerable citizens." The crowd's mood shifted perceptibly as the medical reality sunk in. This wasn't about generational misunderstanding or military overreach. It was about a young man who'd chosen cruelty over compassion and nearly killed someone for entertainment. Mayor Hendricks looked overwhelmed as she tried to restore order. "Perhaps we should discuss concrete steps for moving forward." "The concrete step is simple." Sheriff Chen's voice carried absolute authority. "Tyler Jenkins will be arrested and charged with assault on an elderly person. This is not a debate. It's a statement of fact. The only question is whether this community wants to heal through justice or tear itself apart protecting someone who doesn't deserve protection." Captain Rodriguez stood again, his bearing commanding immediate attention. "The Marines under my command acted within regulations and civilian law. They made no threats, committed no violence, broke no rules. They simply reminded this community that some principles are worth defending." As the meeting dissolved into smaller group discussions, Eleanor found herself studying the faces around her, some angry, some ashamed, some searching for a path forward that would preserve both justice and community harmony. Hank had remained silent throughout the chaos, but now he slowly stood, his movement immediately drawing every eye in the gymnasium. The bandage on his temple caught the fluorescent light as he faced the crowd that had gathered to argue about his pain. "I have something to say," his voice carried despite its age, trained by decades of commanding respect on construction sites and in community meetings. The gymnasium fell silent, waiting for the words that would either heal their divisions or deepen them beyond repair. But those words would have to wait, because Hank Morrison had decided that some conversations required more thought than anger, more wisdom than wounded pride, and more time than a heated public meeting could provide. The gymnasium emptied slowly, people clustering in small groups on the parking lot, their conversations continuing in hushed tones under the pale glow of streetlights. The official meeting had ended without resolution, but the real work of healing, or further division, was just beginning. Marcus Williams sat alone in his rusted pickup truck, staring at his phone. 3 missed calls from his mother, who'd heard about the town meeting through the neighborhood network that moved faster than social media in working-class communities. He knew what she wanted to discuss, the same values she'd tried to instill in him before peer pressure and the desperate need to belong had led him down Tyler's path. Finally, he answered on the 4th ring. "Marcus Anthony Williams, you get yourself home right now." His mother's voice carried the authority of someone who'd raised 3 children as a single parent while working double shifts at the cannery. "Mrs. Patterson called me about what you said at that meeting, about time you found your backbone. Mama, Don't you mama me. You've been running with that Jenkins boy for 2 years, and I've been watching you turn into someone I don't recognize. But tonight you sounded like the son I raised." Marcus drove home through empty streets, passing the diner where this morning's incident had changed everything. The building sat dark now, but he could imagine Grace inside, probably, cleaning tables that were already clean, processing the day's events through the ritual of work. 20 minutes later, he sat at his mother's kitchen table, the same scarred wood surface where she'd helped him with homework, where they'd eaten countless meals, where she'd held him when his father walked out. Carmen Williams was 52, her hands permanently stained from years of factory work, her back permanently bent from carrying weight meant for younger people. "Tell me about this veteran," she said, pouring coffee that was too strong and too bitter, the way she'd made it for 30 years. Marcus described Hank Morrison, his dignity, his politeness, even in the face of cruelty, the way he'd tried to stand despite his injuries. As he spoke, he saw his mother's expression shift from concern to anger to something approaching grief. "Your grandfather was at Pearl Harbor," she said quietly. "Never talked much about it, but sometimes he'd wake up screaming. Used to tell me that respect wasn't about what someone could do for you, it was about what they'd already done for everyone." Meanwhile, across town at the Marine base, Staff Sergeant Santos sat in the chaplain's office, her hands clenched. In her lap, as she struggled with emotions that threatened to overwhelm her military bearing. Chaplain Michael Torres had seen this before, good Marines pushed beyond their limits by situations that triggered deeper wounds. "Talk to me, Maria." Santos stared at the floor, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandfather, Chaplain. He was Pacific Theater, Purple Heart, Bronze Star. Came home and worked construction for 40 years, never complained, never asked for anything." Her voice cracked. "Died alone in a VA facility, while some bureaucrat decided his benefits weren't worth processing. And today's incident brought that back. When I saw that video of Mr. Morrison lying on the pavement, blood coming from his head." Santos's hands trembled. "I saw my grandfather. I saw every veteran who ever came home and got forgotten. And I wanted to do something." "You did do something. You protected him." "Did I, or did I just make the situation worse?" Santos looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Captain Rodriguez is right. We can't solve civilian problems with military solutions, but how do we watch our elders get attacked and do nothing?" At the same moment, Danny Chen was walking through downtown Normandy Falls, his civilian clothes feeling strange after a day of military discipline and community crisis. He'd volunteered for evening patrol, partly to show support for the town, partly because he needed to understand something that had been gnawing at him since morning. He found Hank Morrison sitting on his front porch, Eleanor beside him in the wooden chair that had been her mother's favorite. The evening fog was rolling in from the ocean, wrapping around the small house like a familiar blanket. "Mr. Morrison." Danny approached respectfully, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "I'm PFC Danny Chen from the base. I wondered if I could ask you something." Hank studied the young Marine's face, recognizing something earnest and searching in his expression. "Of course, son. Have a seat." Danny settled on the porch steps, choosing his words carefully. "Sir, I joined the Marines because I wanted to serve something bigger than myself, wanted to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But today, watching what happened to you, seeing how that kid treated you..." He paused, struggling with concepts too large for his 19-year-old vocabulary. "I guess I want to understand what service really means. Not the recruiting poster version, the real version." Hank was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the ocean where the fog bank rolled endlessly toward shore. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 75 years of thinking about these questions. "You know what I learned on Omaha Beach, son? That service isn't about being the hero in your own story. It's about being a supporting character in someone else's." He gestured toward Eleanor. "I served so my daughter could grow up free, so she could choose her own path, even if that path led her away from me." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes as she realized how completely she'd misunderstood her father's sacrifices. "But what about justice?" Danny asked. What about making sure people like Tyler Jenkins face consequences? Justice and revenge aren't the same thing, Hank said gently. Justice is about healing the community. Revenge is about satisfying our anger. The trick is knowing which one you're really seeking. Across town, Tyler Jenkins sat in his father's home office, watching his social media accounts explode with notifications. The video of his assault on Hank had been shared thousands of times, but now it was accompanied by footage from the town meeting, by Marcus's testimony, by images of Marines in formation. What had started as internet fame was becoming internet infamy. His father paced behind the mahogany desk, his phone pressed to his ear as he tried to control damage that seemed to grow exponentially with each passing hour. "I don't care what it costs," Robert barked into the phone. "Get me the best defense attorney on the West Coast. This is character assassination, and I won't stand for it." Tyler watched his father work, recognizing for the first time the familiar pattern. Problem emerges, money gets thrown at it, problem disappears. But something about today felt different. The Marines hadn't wanted his father's money. Marcus's testimony couldn't be bought. The community's disgust wasn't for sale. "Dad!" Tyler's voice was small, uncertain. "What if they're right? What if I really hurt him?" Robert stopped pacing, his face flushing with irritation. "Don't you dare start doubting yourself now. You made a mistake, fine. Everyone makes mistakes. But we don't grovel to these people. These people, Dad, we live here. This is our community." "This community!" Robert's voice carried the contempt of someone who'd never needed anything from his neighbors, needs to remember who signs their paychecks and pays their taxes. For the first time in his privileged life, Tyler Jenkins began to understand that some problems couldn't be solved with money, some bridges couldn't be rebuilt with influence, and some actions carried consequences that wealth and power couldn't erase. As the fog thickened around Normandy Falls, settling over houses where people lay awake, processing the day's events, the foundation of the community had developed cracks that ran deeper than anyone realized. Whether those cracks would widen into irreparable breaks or be sealed by shared understanding remained to be seen. But in the growing darkness, conversations were happening between mothers and sons, between soldiers and veterans, between fathers and daughters, that would determine whether Tyler Jenkins's moment of cruelty would destroy a community or forge it into something stronger than before. The real test was just beginning. 3 days after the town meeting, Grace Murphy made an announcement that surprised everyone. Hank Morrison would speak at the diner on Saturday morning, addressing the community about forgiveness, service, and what it meant to be neighbors. She'd posted handwritten flyers around town, her careful script carrying more authority than any official proclamation. Eleanor found her father in his workshop behind the house, meticulously sanding a piece of driftwood he'd collected years ago but never finished. His hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who'd spent 50 years turning raw materials into useful things. But she could see the tremor that hadn't been there before the assault. "Dad, you don't have to do this. Grace means well, but you don't owe anyone an explanation." Hank continued sanding, the rhythm soothing his thoughts. "Your mother used to say that words have weight, Eleanor, that speaking truth in public places gives it more power than keeping it locked away." He paused, studying the smooth grain emerging from his work. "Maybe it's time I shared some weight I've been carrying alone." Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear, the Pacific fog holding. Offshore, as if nature itself wanted to witness what Hank Morrison had to say. Grace's diner had been transformed. Tables pushed against the walls, chairs arranged in rows facing the corner booth where Hank usually sat alone with his coffee and memories. By 8 a.m., the diner was packed beyond capacity. Marines sat beside. Townspeople, Tyler's former friends next to elderly residents, the artificial divisions of the past week temporarily set aside by curiosity and hope. Staff Sergeant Santos had come in civilian clothes, her usual stern expression softened by something approaching anticipation. Tyler Jenkins sat in the back row with his father, their relationship strained by 3 days of difficult conversations that had finally forced Robert to confront his son's character. Marcus Williams occupied a middle row, his mother beside him, her work-worn hands folded in determination to support whatever Hank might say. Sheriff Chen positioned herself near the door, not expecting trouble but prepared for anything. Captain Rodriguez stood against the far wall, his presence lending gravity to the gathering without overwhelming it. Grace introduced Hank with simple words. Most of you know this man. Some of you have forgotten what he represents. All of you are about to be reminded. Hank rose slowly from his corner booth, the same spot where Tyler had pushed him down just 6 days ago. The bandage was gone from his temple, but the bruising remained visible, a purple reminder of cruelty that would fade but not disappear. "I'm not good at speeches," he began, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. "Never have been. But Grace asked me to share something, and when Grace Murphy asks, you don't say no." Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd, breaking some of the tension. "Most of you know I served in World War II, landed at Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. I was 19 years old, scared out of my mind, and convinced I was going to die on French sand for reasons I didn't fully understand." His gaze found Danny Chen among the Marines. "You know what kept me going through that day and all the days after? It wasn't glory or patriotism or any of the words they put on recruitment posters." He paused, his eyes moving across the assembled, and faces, young and old, military and civilian, friend and stranger. It was Tommy Kowalski from Buffalo, lying next to me in that landing craft, throwing up from seasickness and terror. It was Sergeant Murphy, no relation to Grace here, who died pulling wounded men to safety. It was the understanding that we were all scared, all homesick, all wondering if we'd ever see our families again. His voice strengthened. We served because we were part of something bigger than our individual fears. Eleanor watched her. Father transformed before her eyes, the frail elderly man becoming the leader he'd always been, but rarely displayed. "When that young man pushed me down 6 days ago, my first thought wasn't anger. It was sadness. Sadness that someone so young had never learned what it meant to be part of a community, to understand that every person around you carries stories you can't imagine, wounds you can't see, and dignity that shouldn't be violated for entertainment." Tyler felt heat rise in his cheeks as Hank's gaze found him briefly, not accusatory, but somehow worse, disappointed. "Those Marines who came to town," Hank continued, nodding toward Santos and her colleagues. "They didn't come for revenge. They came because they understood something fundamental about service, that protecting those who can't protect themselves isn't just a military duty, it's a human obligation." Staff Sergeant Santos felt tears threaten as she recognized her grandfather's values reflected in Hank's words. "But here's what I want everyone in this room to understand. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's not excusing harmful behavior or pretending. It didn't happen. Forgiveness is choosing to build something better from the wreckage of what was broken." The room was absolutely silent now, even the usual sounds of morning traffic muted by the weight of Hank's words. "I forgive Tyler Jenkins for pushing me down. I forgive him for filming my humiliation. I forgive him because holding on to anger would poison everything good that's come from this experience. The way this community rallied to support an old man, the way young Marines reminded us all what honor looks like, the way my daughter came home." Eleanor's tears came freely now, years of guilt and regret washing away in the face of her father's grace. But forgiveness doesn't mean avoiding consequences. Tyler will face the legal system as he should. He'll live with the knowledge of what he did as he should, and hopefully he'll learn from it and become the man his community needs him to be. Hank's gaze found Tyler again, and this time the young man didn't look away. "You see, true strength isn't about dominating others or getting the most likes on social media. True strength is about lifting others up, about protecting those who need protection, about choosing compassion over cruelty, even when no one's watching." Marcus Williams felt something shift inside his chest, a clarity he hadn't experienced since childhood. To the Marines in this room, thank you for reminding us that some values are worth defending. To my neighbors, thank you for showing me that I'm not alone in this community. To my daughter, thank you for coming home when I needed you most. He paused, gathering himself for his final words. And to Tyler, you're young enough to change. This doesn't have to define you. But change requires more than apologies. It requires action, service, and a commitment to becoming someone worthy of the forgiveness you've been offered. The silence that followed was profound, broken finally by Grace Murphy's voice. "Thank you, Hank. Thank you for reminding us who we want to be." As applause filled the diner, genuine and heartfelt, Tyler Jenkins sat frozen in his chair, processing words that had cut through every defense he'd constructed. For the first time in his privileged life, he understood that respect couldn't be inherited or purchased. It had to be earned through service to something greater than himself. The real question was whether he had the courage to begin that earning process, or if he would retreat back into the entitled shell that had brought him to this moment of reckoning. Around him, the community of Normandy Falls began the slow work of healing, guided by the moral authority of an elderly veteran who'd chosen grace over grievance, wisdom over wrath, and hope over despair. The grace period lasted exactly 4 days. Tyler Jenkins sat in his Mercedes convertible outside the county courthouse, watching Sheriff Chen escort Marcus Williams up the front steps for his scheduled testimony. In the passenger seat, his phone buzzed with notifications from a social media management company his father had hired to control the narrative. Their strategy was simple: paint Tyler as the victim of military overreach and small-town mob mentality. The problem was, Tyler wasn't sure he wanted to be painted as anything other than what he was. A young man who'd made a terrible mistake and was finally beginning to understand its weight. But his father had other plans. "The deposition starts in 10 minutes, Robert Jenkins said, sliding into the driver's seat with the confident air of someone who'd never lost a legal battle. "Remember what the lawyers coached you on. Marcus Williams is a disgruntled construction worker with a criminal record who's looking for his 15 minutes of fame. You were the victim of an unfortunate accident that's been blown out of proportion by military personnel with an agenda." Tyler stared at the courthouse steps where Marcus had disappeared with Sheriff Chen. "Dad, that's not what happened. That's exactly what happened, and that's what you're going to testify." Robert's voice carried the steel that had built his business empire. "This family doesn't grovel to anyone, especially not to people who work with their hands for a living." Something cold settled in Tyler's stomach as he recognized the contempt in his father's voice, the same contempt that had driven him to push an elderly veteran to the ground for internet entertainment. Inside the courthouse, Marcus Williams sat across from District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, his hands steady as he recounted the morning that had changed everything. This was his third interview with law enforcement, and his story hadn't wavered. Tyler's assault on Hank Morrison had been deliberate, cruel, and recorded for social media validation. "Mr. Williams," DA Walsh said gently, "I need you to understand that Tyler Jenkins's defense team will attack your credibility. They'll bring up your minor criminal record, your association with Tyler's group, your employment history. Are you prepared for that?" Marcus nodded, thinking of his conversation with his mother, of Danny Chen's idealism, of Hank Morrison's dignity in the face of humiliation. "Ma'am, I watched a 22-year-old man push a 95-year-old veteran to the ground while laughing about it. I was part of that. I need to make it right. Meanwhile, Tyler's expensive legal team was implementing a strategy that would have impressed Machiavelli. They'd spent the morning leaking carefully edited portions of Tyler's social media history to friendly outlets, portraying him as a misunderstood young entrepreneur whose innocent video had been weaponized by military extremists and opportunistic witnesses. The strategy worked. By noon, Tyler's assault video was being shared with new context. Commentary tracks explaining how Marines had terrorized a young civilian, how small-town gossips had destroyed a promising young man's future, how political correctness had turned a harmless prank into a federal case. Tyler watched the narrative shift in real time, his follower count climbing as strangers rallied to defend him against what they perceived as authoritarian overreach. Comments poured in calling him a patriot, standing up to military tyranny. A hero fighting small-town corruption, a victim of generational warfare. For a brief moment, Tyler felt the familiar rush of validation, the intoxicating power of internet fame. His father was right. This could all be spun, controlled, managed, until the truth became whatever version served their interests best. Then he saw the video. Someone had posted security footage from the hardware store across from Grace's diner, showing the assault from a different angle. This version captured what Tyler's phone had missed. Hank Morrison's face as he struggled to get up, the genuine confusion and hurt in his eyes, the way his hands shook as he tried to maintain dignity while blood ran from his temple. But worse than Hank's pain was Tyler's expression as he filmed. The cruel satisfaction, the calculating way he'd positioned his phone to capture the best angles of humiliation, the complete absence of human empathy. The comments on this video were different, brutal, unforgiving. This is who you really are, Tyler. A coward who attacks old men for likes. Your daddy's money can't buy you a soul. That man could be your grandfather, you piece of garbage. Tyler's social media accounts became battlegrounds between defenders who saw him as a victim of overreach and critics who saw him as the embodiment of entitled cruelty. The controversy went viral for all the wrong reasons, turning Normandy Falls into a symbol of America's cultural divisions. That afternoon, outside agitators began arriving in town, some supporting Tyler's right to free expression, others demanding justice for veterans. News vans filled the parking lot outside Grace's diner. Cable news pundits debated the case on national television, each side using Tyler and Hank as symbols for their broader political arguments. Sheriff Chen found herself managing protesters from both sides, her small-town police force overwhelmed by a situation that had spiraled far beyond local jurisdiction. Captain Rodriguez received calls from Marine Corps headquarters demanding explanations for his personnel's involvement in civilian matters. The breaking point came at sunset. Tyler, overwhelmed by the national attention and his father's relentless coaching, posted a video response that would haunt him forever. Standing in his father's waterfront office, backed by expensive legal advisors, he delivered a prepared statement that painted himself as the victim of a coordinated attack by military extremists and small-town opportunists. "I'm being persecuted," Tyler said into his phone camera, his voice gaining confidence as he recited his coached lines. A harmless interaction has been twisted into something sinister by people with agendas. Mr. Morrison is being used as a prop by Marines who want to intimidate civilians and by a community that's looking for someone to blame for their own economic failures. The video went viral within hours, shared by political commentators, military critics, and social media influencers who saw opportunity in controversy. Tyler gained 50,000 new followers as the story exploded across news networks and social media platforms. But in Normandy Falls, the reaction was immediate and devastating. Grace Murphy closed her diner early for the first time in 30 years, unable to serve customers while reporters camped outside her windows. Eleanor Morrison found herself screening calls from national media outlets, wanting statements about her father's role in the controversy. Hank himself retreated into his house, overwhelmed by the transformation of his personal pain into political theater. The Marines at the base faced questioning from superiors about their involvement in civilian affairs. Staff Sergeant Santos was formally reprimanded for organizing the unauthorized community action, her military career suddenly at risk because she'd chosen to protect a veteran. As night fell over Normandy Falls, Tyler Jenkins sat in his bedroom watching his social media metrics climb, finally understanding that he'd won the battle for public attention while losing something far more valuable, the chance for redemption that Hank Morrison had offered with such grace just days before. The old veteran's words echoed in Tyler's mind. "You're young enough to change. This doesn't have to define you." But as Tyler watched strangers defend his cruelty and attack Hank's dignity, he realized that some choices, once made public, become prisons of their own construction. He'd chosen internet fame over personal growth, his father's approval over moral courage, and the validation of strangers over the forgiveness of his community. The price of that choice was just beginning to become clear. The Normandy County Courthouse had never hosted proceedings that drew national attention. Built in 1952 with local timber and taxpayer hope, it was designed for fishing license disputes and property line arguments, not the media circus that surrounded Tyler Jenkins's assault trial. By 8 a.m. on the first day of testimony, satellite trucks lined Main Street and protesters held competing signs outside the building's modest entrance. Eleanor Morrison helped her father navigate through the crowd, his cane tapping against pavement still damp from the morning fog. Reporters shouted, questions that bounced off Hank's military bearing like rain off granite. He'd worn his navy blazer with the ribbon bar, the same outfit he'd donned for Margaret's funeral and Eleanor's high school graduation, reserved for occasions that demanded his best. Inside the courtroom, the divisions that had fractured Normandy Falls were on full display. Tyler sat at the defense table in an expensive suit that made him look younger than his 22 years, flanked by 3 lawyers whose hourly rates exceeded most local annual salaries. His father occupied the front row behind him, radiating the confidence of someone who'd never lost a battle that money could win. Across the aisle, Marcus Williams straightened his tie, the only one he owned, purchased specifically for this. A moment, his mother sat beside him, her Sunday dress pressed to crisp perfection, her calloused hands folded in determination to see justice done. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh had prosecuted hundreds of assault cases, but none where the defendant's social media defense had turned a straightforward criminal trial into a national referendum on military authority, generational conflict, and the price of internet fame. The people called Marcus Williams to the stand. Marcus rose on legs that trembled slightly, remembering his mother's words from the night before. "You tell the truth, baby. Just the truth. Everything else will sort itself out." Day Walsh's direct examination was methodical, building the case brick by brick. Marcus described Tyler's group arriving at the coffee shop already in an aggressive mood, looking for entertainment at someone else's expense. His voice grew stronger as he recounted Tyler's deliberate targeting of Hank Morrison, the cruel comments about old fossils, the calculating way Tyler had positioned his phone to capture the assault. "Mr. Williams, in your opinion, was this assault premeditated?" Objection. Tyler's lead attorney, Charles Morrison, no relation to Hank despite the surname, rose with practiced authority. "Calls for speculation." "I'll rephrase," Walsh said smoothly. "Mr. Williams, describe Tyler Jenkins' demeanor before he pushed Mr. Morrison." Marcus closed his eyes, remembering. He was excited, like a kid planning a prank except meaner. He kept saying how this would be perfect for his video, how everyone would love watching some old guy get knocked around. In the gallery, Tyler's supporters shifted uncomfortably. The social media narrative had painted him as an impulsive young man whose joke went too far, not someone who'd planned to assault an elderly veteran for content. Tyler's attorney began his cross-examination with surgical precision, attacking Marcus's credibility through his criminal record, a bar fight at 19 unpaid traffic tickets, his association with Tyler's group. But Marcus had been prepared for this, coached by his mother's simple wisdom. Truth doesn't need embellishment. Mr. Williams, isn't it true that you're testifying against my client because you're hoping for a plea deal on your own pending charges? I don't have any pending charges, sir. But you were present during the assault. Doesn't that make you an accessory? Marcus met the lawyer's gaze steadily. Yes, sir. I was there. I watched it happen and did nothing to stop it. That's something I'll have to live with forever. But Mr. Jenkins pushed Mr. Morrison down while filming it and laughing about it. That's something he'll have to live with too. The courtroom fell silent as Marcus's honesty cut through the legal maneuvering like his mother's factory-sharpened knife through pretense. Staff Sergeant Santos took the stand next, her dress blue, uniform carrying more authority than any law degree. She testified about military culture's reverence for veterans, the significance of D-Day's service, and why Tyler's assault had triggered such a strong response from active military personnel. Staff Sergeant, did you or your Marines threaten Mr. Jenkins in any way? No, ma'am. We stood in formation, maintained discipline, and delivered a message without words that some actions carry consequences. Tyler's attorney tried to paint the Marines' response as intimidation, but Santos's military bearing and measured responses made his attacks feel petty. She explained military protocol, the chain of command that had authorized their community action, and the restraint they'd shown in the face of an assault on someone they considered family. Veterans aren't just former military, counselor. They're the reason you have the freedom to question military authority in a civilian courtroom. Eleanor Morrison's testimony was devastating in its quiet intensity. She described her father's character, his service record, his role in the community, and the impact of Tyler's assault on his daily life. Her voice cracked as she recounted finding him in the hospital, seeing the confusion and hurt in his eyes. My father served this country when he was younger than Tyler Jenkins. He earned the right to walk these streets safely. What Tyler did wasn't a prank. It was cruelty towards someone who'd already given everything for his freedom. Tyler's attorney attempted to portray Eleanor as an absent daughter, seeking to alleviate guilt by attacking his client, but her composed responses and evident love for her father made the strategy backfire. The jury could see a daughter who'd come home to protect a father she'd taken for granted. Danny Chen bridged the generational gap with testimony that connected military idealism to practical service. At 19, he embodied the same age and enthusiasm that Tyler possessed, but channeled towards service rather than self-aggrandizement. Sir, we swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution and to obey the orders of those appointed over us. But there's an unwritten part of that oath, to protect those who came before us, who showed us what service means. When D.A. Walsh called Hank Morrison to the stand, the courtroom's atmosphere shifted perceptibly. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the D-Day veteran facing his attacker in a forum of justice rather than social media spectacle. Hank's testimony was measured, dignified, and heartbreaking. He described the assault factually, without embellishment or anger, but the impact on the jury was visible. Here was a man who'd faced Nazi machine guns with courage, reduced to bleeding on a sidewalk for a young man's entertainment. Mr. Morrison, do you want to see Tyler Jenkins punished? Hank was quiet for a long moment, his gaze finding Tyler across the courtroom. I want to see him learn. I want him to understand that actions have consequences, that other people aren't props for his entertainment, that respect is earned through service, not inherited through privilege. Tyler's attorney's cross-examination was brief and respectful. Attacking a decorated D-Day veteran in front of a jury would have been professional suicide. As the prosecution rested its case, Tyler Jenkins sat frozen between his father's expectations and his growing understanding of what he'd actually done. The testimony had stripped away every excuse, every rationalization, every attempt to minimize his assault on Hank Morrison. For the first time since the incident, Tyler found himself facing the unvarnished truth. He'd deliberately hurt an elderly veteran for internet entertainment, filmed his humiliation, and laughed about it. No amount of legal maneuvering could change those facts. The question now was whether he had the courage to accept responsibility for his actions, or if he would hide behind his father's money and lawyers until the bitter end. Justice was closing in, carried by the measured words of honest people who'd chosen truth over convenience. In the gallery, Hank Morrison sat quietly, finally seeing his community rally around the values he'd fought to defend 79 years ago on a beach in France. 6 months after Tyler Jenkins received 18 months of probation and 500 hours of community service, specifically at the Normandy Veterans Care Center, the fog rolled off the Pacific as it always had, but everything else in Normandy Falls had changed. Tyler arrived at the care center at 6 a.m., as he had every morning for the past 4 months. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by scrubs and work boots worn smooth by honest labor. His phone stayed in his locker. Social media had lost its appeal after learning that real life demanded presence, not performance. "Morning, Mr. Peterson," Tyler said to the 87-year-old Korean War veteran who'd become his reluctant teacher. "How's the hip today?" "Creaky as an old ship," Peterson replied, but his gruff exterior couldn't hide the grudging respect he'd developed for the young man who'd started his service angry and entitled, but had slowly transformed through daily exposure to genuine sacrifice. Tyler had initially approached his community service like everything else in his privileged life, an obligation to endure until he could return to normal. But working with veterans had forced him to confront questions he'd never considered. What would he sacrifice for others? What legacy would his life leave? What did it mean to serve something greater than himself? "Tell me about Chosen again," Tyler said, as he helped Peterson with his morning routine. The stories had become a bridge between generations, teaching Tyler that heroism wasn't about social media metrics, but about quiet courage in the face of impossible odds. Across town, Marcus Williams was preparing for his departure to Marine Corps boot camp. The assault trial had crystallized his understanding of service versus selfishness, and his testimony had earned him a waiver for his minor criminal record. His mother watched from the kitchen doorway as he packed his sea bag, pride and worry warring in her expression. "You sure about this, baby?" Marcus looked up from his packing, his face carrying a certainty that had been absent for years. "I watched real Marines show me what honor looks like, Mama. Time I learned to live up to that example." At Grace's diner, Eleanor Morrison poured coffee for the morning crowd, her corporate clothes replaced by an apron that bore coffee stains and small-town authenticity. She'd taken early retirement to care for her father and discovered that serving her community provided satisfaction no boardroom victory had ever delivered. "Hank's speaking at the high school today," Grace mentioned, wiping down the counter with practiced efficiency. "Veterans Day presentation." Eleanor nodded, watching her father through the window as he walked slowly but steadily toward the school. The annual Veterans Day ceremony had become Normandy Falls' most important community event, drawing people together around shared values rather than dividing them along generational lines. The Normandy Falls High School auditorium was packed, But this time, the atmosphere carried hope rather than division. Hank Morrison stood at the podium, where Tyler Jenkins had once been surrounded by Marines, now addressing students who listened with the respect that his generation had earned through service and sacrifice. True strength, Hank concluded his presentation, his voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium, isn't about what you can take from others. It's about what you're willing to give. In the audience, Tyler Jenkins sat beside Mr. Peterson, no longer the entitled young man who'd assaulted an elderly veteran for internet fame. Community service had transformed him from someone who consumed respect into someone learning to earn it, one day of service at a time. As applause filled the auditorium, Normandy Falls had become something it had never been before. A community that had faced its divisions honestly and chosen healing over hatred, growth over grievance, and service over selfishness. The foundation was new, built on the understanding that respect flows not from privilege or power, but from the simple choice to lift others up rather than tear them down. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.